Makes Me Want to Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 22 Jim. 2 years into my prison stint, Liz had started writing me again, and we talked about the possibility of getting back together. I was also starting to have trouble with my Christian fellowship group. There were too many weirdos joining up to seek protection from the wolves, and it was becoming hard to talk with the Christians about all the things I was learning and thinking about. My mental and spiritual regimen had begun to make me feel whole for the first time in my life, and I wasn't about to give that up just to please some jackleg wannabe preachers. Maybe that's why I started listening to a guy named Jim, who was the most respected inmate at Southampton. A Richmond native in his mid-30s, Jim was on the tail end of a life sentence for murder. He'd done close to 15 years in the joint. He was admired partly because of the way he handled his time, but mostly because of his integrity and broad intellect. Unlike so many other dudes who became mentally passive after years in prison, Jim had somehow remained a free thinker who stayed focused on the world beyond that fence. Using his prison time to educate himself, he'd evolved into a self-assured, articulate brother with an unyielding commitment to what he called black folks' struggle. Administrators were so impressed with his intelligence that they allowed him to teach inmates at the institution's school. I seen him around the yard a lot, but for a long time kept my distance. Jim hated the white man, and I was trying to internalize Christian love. By the summer of '77, I had begun to fast once weekly, spending those days mostly in my room, praying, thinking, and reading everything from poetry to philosophy to books about nutrition. I read Pearl Buck's novels and Hermann Hesse and The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. I found myself drawn to the novels of Chaim Potok, including My Name is Asher Lev, a book about a young artist that gave me insight into Jewish culture and whetted my curiosity about art, especially Picasso. I'd never known art could be used so powerfully to make social and political statements. I experimented with a memory technique and learned how to recall up to 100 numbers, words, and names in sequential order. There were times I got so deep into reading and fasting that I felt I transcended the constraints of prison. In those moments, it seemed not to matter whether I stayed behind bars another year or an eternity. With all this going on inside me, I think that's why I became more curious about what Jim had to say. Some evenings, he held court on the yard, and guys gathered around and listened to him preach about the white man's evil ways. Eventually, I went with one of my homeboys, a guy called Mahdi, to check him out. Jim's message reminded me of what I heard from Chicago, the black revolutionary I met in Norfolk jail, and much of it was similar to the teachings of Malcolm X and the Muslims. Don't you know white men are the most lying creatures on the face of the earth? They don't care nothing about the truth. They use falsehood to gain dominance over people, and they use trickery to maintain that dominance. They run a game on black folks by trying to get them to think bad things about themselves that aren't true and believe good things about white people that are outright lies. Think about it. White folks claim we're lazy and don't want to work. Our people worked for crackers for 200 years for free, man, because white folks were too lazy to work for themselves. Our women cooked, cleaned their houses, and raised their children because whites were too trifling to do their own work, yet they're going to call us lazy. If you look around today, black folks still do most of the work that whitey don't want to do. Check this out. White folks claim we constantly have illegitimate babies and abandon them. During slavery, they raped black women and fathered more illegitimate children than we can count. Why do you think there's so many coffee brown and light-skinned black folks like me and you? That's because we come from all those children that white men father and abandon, man. And they try to pretend it's us that's got a thing for white women. White men live for the day to get a piece of that black meat. Think about it, brother. I don't care what we produce or invent. White folks don't want to acknowledge its worth unless they can steal it and take credit for it themselves. Look at all the things black folks invented and had stolen from them. Look at how whites worship Elvis Presley. Black folks been singing soul music for years, and whites wouldn't give them their due, and then along comes Elvis, imitating black soul, and they treat him like he's God. Everything Jim said seemed to have the ring of truth. After he finished, I chatted with him. We hit it off real well. When he learned I was a Christian, he challenged me to rethink my commitment to the white man's religion. He said white folks love for blacks to embrace Christianity because they use it to control us. He said whites encouraged us to follow Martin Luther King Jr. because he was a passive Christian, and they urged us to reject Malcolm X because he challenged us to stand up against white oppression. If Christianity is such an effective religion, then why hasn't it helped white people become more humane? Most of the white people in this country are Christians, and still they're the most hateful, ruthless group of people on the face of the earth. Open your eyes, man. Black Christians are no better. They believe that they ain't righteous unless they suffer like Jesus suffered. Christianity got black people thinking we got to be crucified in this life in order to get a piece in the next one. I want what's coming to me in this life, here and now, man. White Christians are also imperialists. Check anywhere in the world, and you will find that where there are white people, there is Christianity, and there are missionaries. They send the Christian missionaries in first to preach, turn the other cheek, then they come with their armies and conquer the people. I began to see what he was talking about. Books I found in the library told me that whites in South Africa, Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain, not to mention America, had oppressed people of color whenever they encountered them. Practically every place I could identify where there were whites, people of color were suffering at their hands. Jim was right about something else too. The prison administration was very supportive of our Christian fellowship group. They knew Christian inmates were the most easily controlled. They made sure they provided space for our activities, often suspending rules to accommodate us. At the same time, the Muslims, who were considered more radical, complained that the administration was less supportive of them. The control issue sealed my split with Christianity. I wanted no part of anything used by white people to control blacks. In his talks, Jim also focused a lot on history. He said it was important to understand the past because it shapes our present perceptions about ourselves and the rest of the world. He said white people think they're better than everybody else because they are taught a history of distorted facts that always present whites in a positive, superior light. Think about it, man. They teach you that the white settlers who came over here were heroes, and we celebrate Thanksgiving to commemorate their heroism. But check this out. When the settlers were starving, the Indians helped feed them. The Indians helped them survive through the winter. The settlers repaid them by killing them off and taking their land. Now you tell me, were the white settlers heroes or fucking barbarians? I thought about all the lies and the indoctrination I had absorbed all through school. Every year, teachers drilled into our heads myths about the heroic white pioneers who sailed from England and settled Jamestown, Virginia. Relics of that settlement have been preserved through the years to support the myths. I remembered that my 4th and 5th grade classes took field trips to Jamestown Settlement, which is about a 40-minute drive from Portsmouth, and visited replicas of the tiny ships the whites rode here. When I was young, I accepted my teacher's versions of stories about Jamestown and everything else I was taught because there was no reason to question it. I figured that if it was contained in school books, then it must be true. Throughout school, except during Black History Week, we were taught more about everybody else than about ourselves. I'll never forget that one of my junior high school history teachers made us memorize all the dynasties of the Chinese Empire from start to finish in chronological order. Yet the story of Africans brought here as slaves was summed up in our history books in a few short paragraphs, almost a footnote. On some level, that communicated the message that we were less important than everyone else. I wonder how my black teachers could permit such a thing. I understand now that they taught what was approved for the school system, and that while schools have been integrated for blacks and whites, administrators have still failed to integrate the information passed along to us. In my reading, I also learned that we've been grossly misled in school about the Indians. Our textbooks always portrayed Native Americans as primitive heathens who threatened to obstruct the settlers' noble mission. That version of history was promoted by TV westerns that showed brave cowboys battling savage Indians who attacked them for no apparent reason. When I was young, I thought those Indians were crazy with their feather headdresses and painted faces, riding horses and yelling like they had lost their minds. When I learned that those Indians were actually fighting to protect what was rightfully theirs, that they were the true heroes, and that the settlers were the savages, like Jim said, it made me furious to know that whites so arrogantly distorted the truth. I reflected on those and other myths that may have influenced my thinking as a child, and I realized that Malcolm X, Chicago, Jim, and so many other cats were right. Black people have been systematically brainwashed, and our parents have paid their tax dollars for the schools, biased textbooks, and curriculums that help carry that out. Without realizing it, we've been taught to hate ourselves and love white people, and it was causing us to self-destruct. Jim and I started exchanging books and talking regularly about the effect of historical myths on blacks. We met in the yard most evenings after chow and talked to other guys who also did a lot of reading. In that group, I met some of the sharpest, most intelligent guys I've known then or since. Most of them were dropouts who had long before lost interest in formal schooling, but once they got a whiff of some real knowledge that was relevant to them, they educated themselves far better than any public school could have hoped to do. We formed our own writers' guild, discussed world affairs and politics, and talked about what we intended to do when we got out. Those were the deepest discussions I'd ever had. We debated theories of the major philosophers, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Sartre, among others. We dissected dualism, pantheism, and existentialism, and discussed questions such as, how can you appreciate good until you've known evil? Does essence precede existence, or does existence precede essence? Sometimes during those conversations, I was struck by the strangeness of former robbers, drug dealers, and murderers standing in the middle of a prison yard debating the heaviest philosophical questions of all time. Jim, who also worked constantly to improve his vocabulary, taught me to play the word game Scrabble. He'd memorized many of the 2, 3, and 4-letter words in the dictionary to help him score high points. We were often joined in fierce matches by Lee Hargrave, the serial murderer who worked for me in the library. One day, after Hargrave had won the game and left the room, Jim said, "Hey man, we can't let this white boy beat us on the Scrabble board." Initially, I didn't get it. What's the problem? Don't you know this cracker thinks he's smarter than us because he's white and we're black? Can't you tell that? He's always trying to bluff us with medical words he thinks we don't know. I knew what Jim meant. I got that same feeling when I played whites at chess. I got the feeling that white boys automatically assumed they could beat me on the board because chess was a thinking person's game. I was black and they were white, and therefore they were better thinkers. They never came out and said it, but I could tell by their confident body language and their smug analysis of moves made during games that they assumed they were superior. That's why, whenever I played whites at chess, the fun went completely out of the game. It was war disguised as a game. Every nerve in my body stood on end, and my mind focused sharply on every piece on the board. I was like a boxer, eyeing an opponent's every feint and move, ready to use sharply honed reflexes to make him pay dearly for the slightest mistake. I suspected Hargrave thought he was smarter than everybody else at Southampton. He had an elitist air about him. Even after being at Southampton more than a year, he still rarely spoke to more than a few select people and still refused to eat in the cafeteria. While everybody else read Ebony, Jet, Time, Newsweek, and other mass circulation periodicals in the library, Hargrave subscribed to his own Town and Country magazine. Curious, I borrowed an issue from him once and leafed through it. It carried stories and pictures about rich white people who spent their time horseback riding, fox hunting, and managing their stables and shit. When Hargrave's parents came to visit him, his father wore a business suit and a tie, and his mother wore a dress. Out of place in the visiting room with all those working class black people, they looked stiff and formal, like Beaver Cleaver's parents on TV. Every time I went into the visiting room, his parents made it a point to come over to my table to say an artificial hello to my family and me. I sensed they were unaccustomed to interacting with black people, yet they were trying to encourage me to cultivate a relationship with their son. They were well aware that he was in constant danger because of his crimes against elderly people, and I suspected they viewed me as somebody who could help protect him if the need arose. But I wasn't about to let them use me. I knew that if those rich white people passed me on the streets, they would probably roll up their car windows and lock their doors. After Jim pulled my coat to Hargrave, we came up with a way to cheat him like white folks cheat us. Jim, who was a great defensive Scrabble player, made sure he sat in front of Hargrave to prevent him from getting openings to score high points. Whenever Hargrave took the lead, Jim and I secretly fed each other key letters to make sure one of us won the game. Hargrave never won a game after that. I don't know if he caught on, but it didn't matter. No one else in our building played Scrabble. He loved the game, so he had to play with us or not play at all. In a way, Jim was also similar to Mo Battle, my mentor in the Norfolk jail. When he saw young guys with potential come out of the receiving unit, he'd take the time to school them about anything he could. He pulled them aside and tell them the do's and don'ts of prison life so the wolves couldn't get to them. The wolves resented Jim because of that, but none made a move to do anything about it. It amazed me to see how much the so-called tough cats respected Jim. Whenever he was around, they cursed less and toned down their macho posturing as if he were an authority figure or a revered elder. Initially, that kind of deference, which bordered on fear, puzzled me because Jim didn't carry himself like a knockout artist or anything. Brown-skinned and medium-built, he always dressed neat and spoke softly. He was clean-shaven, and he constantly carried books and newspapers tucked under his arms. Eventually, I figured out that the characteristics that made him so widely respected had little to do with how he looked. Instead, it was his manly demeanor. Ever since I could recall, I and everybody else I knew had associated manhood with physical dominance and conquest of someone else. Watching Jim, I realized we'd gone about it all wrong. Jim didn't have to make a rep for himself as a thumper. He could whip a man with his sharp mind and choice words far more thoroughly than with his fists. The wolves feared his kind of ass whipping much more than the physical beating, so they kept their distance. I decided that this was the kind of respect I wanted to command, and I noticed other guys who, without being fully aware, wanted to be like Jim too. They strutted on the yard, looking super macho, like killers, but acted differently in private. In those moments when they weren't profiling with their buddies, some of my tough-acting homies would stop by my perch on the yard or in my cell and ask, "What you reading?" I sensed they wanted to improve themselves, but didn't want their other homies to see them, because self-improvement wasn't a macho thing. Pearly Blue was one of them. He sometimes tried to draw me into deep, private discussions about God and reality while sticking to the tough street vernacular that helped him maintain his macho facade. As I learned more about our misguided ideas about manhood, I experimented with some of those macho dudes. Whenever I passed them, I looked into their eyes to see what was there. A few had that cold-blooded killer look about them, but in the eyes of most of them, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: fear. Even in Big Earl. Big Earl was one of the brawniest, most outwardly fearless cats in the place. He was tall and jet black. His muscles rippled through his t-shirt, and his thighs were so massive that all his pants fit too tight. Big Earl, who was 30-ish, was from a small, off-brand town in rural Virginia, but he didn't need homies to back him up. He walked around the yard, talking loud and intimidating other inmates like he owned the place. One day, while walking down the long sidewalk on my way to the cafeteria, I spotted Big Earl pimping toward me. He never said anything to me, Jim, or some of the others who were part of our progressive group. As he approached, I fixed my eyes on his and kept them locked there. When we got closer, I kept my eyes fastened to his, not in a hostile gaze, but in an expression of serene self-assurance. Initially, he tried to meet my gaze, then he turned his eyes away and looked toward the ground. I smiled to myself. I would have never been able to back down Big Earl in a rumble, but I had certainly backed him down with my mind. Several times after that brief silent encounter, I caught Big Earl watching me curiously. He never said anything, he just watched and turned whenever he realized I caught him staring. I sensed he knew I figured that he wasn't as confident of his manhood as he pretended to be, and he felt naked, exposed. I practiced a piercing eye contact with other guys like Earl and realized that few of the seriously bad cats could meet my gaze. That helped me see my homies and the other toughs of Southampton as they were and as I had been. Streetwise pseudo-badasses who were really frightened boys, bluffing, trying to mask their fear of the world behind muscular frames. Jim made parole in 1977. The word spread fast across the yard that he would soon be leaving. This dude, who had been locked up since 1962, longer than anybody else there, was getting out and was regarded as a momentous occasion at Southampton. The day Jim left, hordes of guys lined up along the sidewalk to watch him walk out. The guys in our group, including me, were saddened. It was always that way when good friends left. You were glad they were getting out, yet sorrowful because they helped you do your time. Before leaving, Jim chatted with us a few minutes, dropped a few more morsels of advice on us, then said, "Later, man. I'll keep in touch." That was the only time I ever saw a hint of apprehension on his face. With his arms loaded down with a box full of books and other possessions, he walked slowly to the administration building. He waved one last time, then turned his head held high and disappeared through the door.